June 6, 1944, 10 o'clock at night. The moon over the Cebutu Passage in the Philippines was so bright you could read a newspaper by it, and in that silver light, a Japanese destroyer named Minazuki was hunting an American submarine on the surface. A Mutsuki-class ship of roughly 1,300 tons standard displacement bearing down. Her guns coming up, her searchlight already stabbing across the water. The submarine's captain had a choice: dive and pray or turn and fight. Every training manual in the United States Navy said dive. Every officer on his bridge expected dive. What he did instead is the reason his name is still spoken with quiet respect in the wardrooms of both fleets. His name was Samuel Dealey, and this is the story of the 4 days in June when one American submarine shattered the confidence of the Imperial Japanese fleet. But before we go into those waters, you need to understand something. In the early years of the Pacific War, there was an unwritten rule among American submarine commanders. A rule so absolute that violating it was considered nothing short of suicide. Never fight a destroyer. A destroyer was a warship built for one purpose: to kill submarines. 2,000 tons of armored steel. 5-inch guns capable of shredding a submarine's conning tower in seconds. Sonar systems designed to hunt targets hidden beneath the waves. And depth charges. Barrels of high explosive dropped in patterns that could crush a submarine's pressure hull like an empty tin can. Destroyer moved at 35 knots on the surface. A submerged submarine struggled to reach 9. The math was cruel. The math was simple. The math had one answer. If a destroyer found you, you ran. You dove deep. You went silent. You prayed. Between December of 1941 and the first months of 1944, the American submarine force learned this lesson the hard way. Boat after boat vanished. Some were lost to mines, some to bad luck. But many, too many, died at the hands of Japanese destroyer captains who knew exactly how to hunt a submerged enemy. And there was another problem, a problem the American Navy did not want to admit. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary weapon of every submarine in the Pacific Fleet, had plagued the submarine force for the first 2 years of the war. Depth control failures, magnetic detonators that fired at the wrong moment, contact exploders that crumpled on impact instead of firing. American commanders had watched perfect shots pass harmlessly beneath enemy ships. They had watched torpedoes strike their targets and simply bounce off without death. By late 1943, most of those problems had been solved. Admiral Charles Lockwood at Pearl Harbor had ordered the magnetic detonators. The contact exploders had been redesigned. By the spring of 1944, the Mark 14 was finally a reliable weapon. But the memory of those failures still lived in every submarine wardroom. This was the world Samuel Dealey entered when he took command of the USS Harder in December of 1942. He was 36 years old, born in Dallas, Texas, on September 13, 1906. His father died when Sam was 6 years old. His mother raised 5 children alone, moving briefly to California before returning to Dallas, where Sam graduated from Adamson High School in 1925. He was not a large man. He was not loud. Those who served with him described him with the same words over and over: quiet, gentle, almost too polite to be a warrior. He was the nephew of George Bannerman Dealey, the powerful publisher of the Dallas Morning News. Decades later, a plaza in downtown Dallas would be named after his uncle. And on a bright November afternoon in 1963, that plaza would become the site of an event that scarred the American memory forever. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy would be assassinated in Dealey Plaza. That was still 19 years in the future. In 1942, Samuel Dealey was simply a naval officer with a wife, Edwina, 3 young children, and a brand new submarine. He had graduated from the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1930. He had served on battleships, on destroyers, and finally on submarines. When war came, the Navy pulled him from the older S-20 and gave him command of Harder, a Gatto-class submarine being fitted out at Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut. Harder was commissioned on December 2, 1942. Samuel Dealey was her first commanding officer. He would be her only commanding officer. For the next 20 months, until the day the sea took them both, Samuel Dealey and Harder would be inseparable. His crew loved him. That is the word they used. Not respected, not admired, loved. He knew every man on his boat by name. He knew their wives and their sisters and the towns they came from. When a young sailor made a mistake, Dealey did not shout, he explained. Somewhere on the boat, taped to the inside of his locker, was a photograph. 3 small children back in Dallas. He carried them with him into every patrol. He would not see them grow up. Did not know that yet. He was, by every account, the least likely man in the American submarine force to become a legend for aggressive tactics. And yet, if you had a father, uncle, or grandfather who served in the Second World War, take a moment right now to hit the like button on this video. What comes next is why that generation earned the name history. On April 13, 1944, Samuel Dealey did something that no submarine commander in the United States Navy had ever done before. He turned toward a destroyer at full speed, and he pulled the trigger. Harder was on her fourth war patrol. The Pacific sun was hot. A Japanese aircraft had spotted her about 200 nautical miles south of Guam and had radioed her position to a destroyer that was hunting. That destroyer was Ikuzuchi, an Akatsuki-class special-type destroyer, 1,750 tons of steel and speed. Ikuzuchi carried 6 127mm naval guns, dozens of depth charges, and a crew that had spent more than 2 years in combat. Earlier in the war, this same destroyer had rescued more than 400 survivors of the British cruiser HMS Exeter and the destroyer HMS Encounter after the battle. She had done a hard war. Now she was hunting an American submarine. By every rule in every training manual, Dealey should have dived. He should have gone deep. He should have run. Instead, he raised the periscope and studied the incoming destroyer. Every officer in the conning tower waited for the order. Take her deep. Rig for silent running. Prepare for depth charges. The order that came was not the one they expected. Ahead flank. Flank, speed. The fastest the boat could push through the water. Open outer doors. Set up down the throat. The executive officer looked at his captain. Dealey did not look back. He was watching Ikuzuchi grow larger in the periscope. Sir? We're going to shoot her, Dealey said. His voice was calm. It was the same voice he used to greet his men in the morning. Right down her throat. Ikuzuchi kept coming. At 900 yards, Harder fired 4 torpedoes. Ikuzuchi was moving at more than 30 knots. Her bow was pointed directly at Harder's periscope. There was no zigzag. There was no evasion. Because destroyers were the hunters. Submarines were the prey. Destroyers did not need to evade. 2 of Harder's torpedoes struck home. Ikuzuchi went up in a single blinding flash. As she sank, her own depth charges cooked off in the water and finished the job. There were no survivors. The destroyer that had been charging Harder at flank speed simply ceased to exist. Dealey watched through the periscope until the water was empty. Then he turned to his radio operator. Send this to Pearl. The message that Samuel Dealey transmitted that afternoon would become the most quoted radio dispatch in the history of the American submarine force. Expended 4 torpedoes and 1 Jap destroyer. 9 words. In the plain language of that, at Pearl Harbor, when the message was decoded, the officers of the submarine command laughed out loud. They read it again. They read it a 3rd time. Then someone tacked it to the wall. In Tokyo, nobody was laughing. But here is the part the official history books usually skip. What happened on April 13th was not the story. It was the rehearsal. Admiral Somu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was 59 years old. He was a small, hard-eyed man who had spent his entire adult life at sea. He understood mathematics, he understood logistics, and he understood better than almost anyone in Japan that his country was losing. Between January and May of 1944, Japan had lost a growing number of destroyers to American submarines and ships that could not be replaced fast enough. Ships his shrinking fleet desperately needed. Now, one American submarine had just added another destroyer to the list. In broad daylight. In minutes. And that submarine had a name, Harder. Toyota made a note. He would not forget. But there was another reason the loss of destroyers cut so deep. Toyota was preparing for the largest naval operation Japan had attempted since the disaster at Midway 2 years. It was called Operation A-Go. Its purpose was to smash the American Pacific Fleet in a single decisive battle, to lure the American carriers into range of Japanese air power and destroy them. For A-Go to succeed, Japan needed destroyers. Destroyers to screen the carriers. Destroyers to escort the fuel convoys. Destroyers to protect the battle. Destroyers to hunt down the American submarines that were now bleeding the Japanese Navy dry. Every destroyer sunk was a wound, and Japan could not afford another wound. By late May of 1944, Admiral Toyota had concentrated the mobile fleet at a place called Tawi-Tawi. It was a remote anchorage in the Sulu archipelago, tucked between the southern tip of the Philippines and the northern coast of Borneo. Battleships including the mighty Yamato aircraft carrier, Heavy cruisers, destroyers by the dozen, the largest concentration of Japanese naval power the Pacific had seen in a long time. Tawi-Tawi was chosen because it was close to the oil fields of Borneo. Japan's warships were dying of thirst. Their fuel reserves were nearly gone. At Tawi-Tawi, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carriers could refuel directly from the tankers that shuttled between the anchorage and the Borneo oil terminal. But Tawi-Tawi had a weakness. It had no airfield, which meant no aerial patrols, which meant that the passages leading in and out of the anchorage, the narrow straits between the islands, were the only line of defense. If an American submarine could get into those passages, it would find the beating heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy laid bare. At Pearl Harbor, American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval ciphers. They knew Tawi-Tawi. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarines Pacific, and Rear Admiral Ralph Christie, commander of Submarines Southwest Pacific, coordinated the assignment. Harder was to depart Fremantle, Australia, on May 26, 1944. Her mission was twofold. First, she would recover a party of Australian coast watchers and commandos along the northeast coast of Borneo. Dangerous mission through enemy waters, but not, by submarine standards, an unusual one. The second part of her orders was less specific. Patrol the waters around Tawi-Tawi. Report enemy fleet movements. Attack targets of opportunity. Samuel Dealey read the orders in his cabin on the evening of May 25th. Then he walked out onto the pier and looked at his boat. Harder was 311 feet of black steel. She carried 20 24 Mark 14 torpedoes, 4 diesel engines, and 79 men. She was one of the finest killing machines the American submarine force had produced. Whatever Sam Dealey was thinking that night, he did not write it down. But the days that followed would speak for him. May 26, 1944, Fremantle Harbor, Western Australia. The morning was cold, the kind of cold that finds its way into a man's bones and stays there. Harder cast off her lines at dawn, 79 men, 1 submarine, 24 torpedoes. Samuel Dealey stood on the bridge with his hands in the pockets of his foul weather jacket, watching the Australian coastline shrink behind him. He was going home, not to Dallas, not to Edwina, not to his 3 children. Home for Samuel Dealey was 311 feet of steel and the men inside it. The submarine turned north. The war was waiting. The first part of the mission went smoothly. Harder made her way through the Lombok Strait, then east into the Celebes Sea, then north along the coast of Borneo. Then Dealey pointed Harder's bow toward the passages of Tawi-Tawi, and the world became a very different place. The Sibutu Passage is a narrow strip of water, 12 miles wide at its broadest point. It separates the Sulu Sea from the Celebes Sea. It is the front door to Tawi-Tawi. If you are a Japanese fleet commander in the spring of 1944, and you want your ships to sortie safely out into the open Pacific, you go through Sibutu, which means Sibutu was crawling with destroyers. Samuel Dealey took Harder into that passage at dusk on June 6, 1944. The Japanese combined fleet was just miles away. Yamato was at Tawi-Tawi. Ozawa was at Tawi-Tawi. Almost every major warship of the Imperial Japanese Navy was at Tawi-Tawi, and Harder was 1 submarine. That night, the moon was up, nearly full. The kind of moon that turns the sea into a silver mirror. The kind of moon that makes a surfaced submarine look like a shadow on a stage. Harder's lookout spotted them. 3 tankers, escorted by destroyers. Dealey climbed to the bridge with his binoculars. The lead destroyer was Minazuki. His plan was simple. Get in close on the surface, fire at the tankers, slip away. The moon had a different plan. Minazuki spotted something on the water. A shape, a shadow. A silhouette that did not belong. She turned. Her bow came around. She began to run it harder. Every submarine commander in the American fleet had trained for this moment. Every training manual said the same. Emergency done. Get down. Go deep. Silent running. Pray. Samuel Dealey submerged, turned in, and prepared his shot. Harder fired 3 torpedoes. 2 of them struck. Minazuki broke apart. She burned. She rolled. Within minutes, she was gone. Beneath a bright moon in the Sibutu Passage, the first Japanese destroyer of that patrol simply ceased to be. The rest of the convoy scattered. Harder was held at bay for a time by depth charges. The tank at Sam Dealey was not finished. Now here is the part most people have never heard. June 7th, 1944. Another destroyer was moving through the Sibutu Passage that day. Her name was Hayanami, a Kagero-class ship. Roughly 2,000 tons of steel and speed and violence. Harder detected Hayanami and closed to attack. Harder submerged, turned, and fired torpedoes at the destroyer as she came on. According to the post-war Naval History and Heritage Command account, 2 of Harder's torpedoes struck home. One of them found Hayanami's magazine. The explosion tore the destroyer apart. Her stern was ripped off. Her bow rose. And then, in what witnesses describe as almost unnatural silence, the destroyer that had been sent to hunt Harder went straight down, tail first, into the Sibutu Passage. Most of her crew went with her. The Japanese Navy had now lost 2 destroyers to Harder in less than 24 hours. In Tokyo, at Combined Fleet Headquarters, Admiral Toyoda received the news at daybreak. He ordered more destroyers pulled from other duties. He ordered them into the passages around Tawi-Tawi with 1 mission. Find the American submarine. Sink her, do not fail. Inside Harder, the men were exhausted. The air was thick. The temperature in the after compartments was climbing past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat rolled down the backs of the enlisted men working the diesel engines. Sweat rolled down the faces of the officers in the conning tower. Sam Dealey walked slowly through the boat. He did not say much. He put his hand on a young sailor's shoulder. He asked a torpedoman about his little brother back home. He drank cold coffee from a chipped mug. Then he went back to the periscope. He was not finished, but before the next battle came, there was a promise to keep. You need to understand what Admiral Toyoda was about to do next. But first, Sam Dealey had a mission that most histories of Harder mention only in passing, a mission that speaks to the man he was. On the night of June 8th, in a small bay along the northeast coast of Borneo, Harder crept toward the shore. A rubber boat was launched. In the darkness, 6 exhausted men waded out through the surf to meet it. They were Australian commandos led by Lieutenant Bill Jenkins. They had spent weeks behind Japanese lines gathering intelligence. Now they needed to come home. Sam Dealey brought his submarine close to a Japanese-held coast. In the middle of the most dangerous patrol of his life, with hunter-killer groups scouring the passages for his blood, he stopped to save 6 men he had never met. Wet, exhausted, silent men climbed down the deck hatches and vanished into the belly of the submarine. Dealey greeted each one. He gave them coffee. He gave them a bunk. Then he pointed Harder's boat bow back toward the passages of Tawi-Tawi. June 9th, 1940. That evening, Harder sighted 2 Japanese destroyers patrolling the narrowest part of the Sibutu Passage. According to the Naval History and Heritage Command, they were just 6 miles from Tawi-Tawi, 6 miles from the beating heart of the Japanese fleet. Their bows were sometimes overlapping when viewed through the crosshairs. That geometry mattered, because if the shot was set up correctly, a single spread of torpedoes could line up on 2 ships at once. Dealey submerged and made an undetected approach. At 1,000 yards, Harder fired 4 torpedoes at the overlapping targets. The second and third torpedoes blasted destroyer Tanakaze, a Kagero-class ship of approximately 2,500 tons. Her boilers erupted in a terrific explosion. She sank almost immediately. The other destroyer above them expended its depth charges in the inevitable counterattack and eventually withdrew. That was 3 Japanese destroyers sunk by Harder in 4 days. It was the pattern the Japanese Navy would never live down, and this is where the story becomes almost impossible to believe. Sam Dealey did not run for open water. He turned Harder north, back toward Tawi-Tawi, not away, toward. June 10th, 1940. Harder was in position off the Japanese anchor. Dealey raised the scope. What he saw made every officer in the conning tower stop breathing. A Japanese task force underway, battleships, heavy cruisers, a screen of destroyers. Elements of the mobile fleet were sortieting to sea, and one of the destroyers had just seen Harder's periscope. The destroyer turned. Her bow swung toward Harder. She began to accelerate. Every rule of submarine warfare said to dive, to evade, to disappear. Samuel Dealey did what he had done at Ikazuchi, down the throat. According to the account preserved by the National Medal of Honor Museum, at approximately 1,500 yards, Dealey fired 3 torpedoes at the charging destroyer and ordered his boat to dive. Harder plunged. Her bow dropped hard. She passed roughly 80 feet beneath the destroyer's keel, and at that moment 2 of the torpedoes struck home. The Japanese warship exploded so violently that Harder, running deep below her, was rocked bodily by the shockwave. Above her, the destroyer was breaking apart. Naval historians debate whether the June 10th destroyer sank or was left in sinking condition. The Naval History and Heritage Command credits Harder with damaging the destroyer that day. Some accounts credit her with a 4th kill. What is not debated is the effect on the men watching from other Japanese warships. The Japanese mobile fleet had just seen one of its escorts destroyed by an unseen enemy in broad daylight. And then Dealey did the thing that would change the war. The next day, June 11th, he took Harder back into the very approaches of Tawi. He crept in at periscope depth. He counted the ships still in the harbor. He noted the tankers, the auxiliaries, the remaining warships. Then at 1600 hours, he headed for the open sea. That night, he transmitted his observation. The report reached Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the American Fifth Fleet, currently steaming toward the Mariana Islands. Spruance now knew where the Naval History and Heritage Command would later describe Dealey's contact report as being of vital importance to Spruance's fleet prior to the decisive Battle of the Philippine Sea. But there was another consequence to Harder's Fifth Patrol, a consequence Sam Dealey could not see. Consequence that was unfolding in a wooden paneled cabin aboard the flagship of the Japanese mobile. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was 57 years old. He commanded the finest carrier force still afloat in the Japanese Navy. And he was, that day, staring at a report that made no sense to him. 3 destroyers lost, others damaged, in just a few days. To what? The first reports suggested a wolf pack, multiple American submarines, coordinated attacks. The Cebu Passage was compromised. The anchorage itself might be next. Ozawa did not know that all of the destroyer attacks were the work of one submarine. He could not know the pattern of the attacks, the speed of the losses, the audacity of a nighttime surface engagement inside his own defensive screen. None of it fit the profile of a single boat. It had to be many. And if it was many, then Tawi was surrounded. Ozawa concluded that the mobile fleet could not remain safely at anchor. The larger schedule of Operation A-Go was already coming apart under American pressure elsewhere. The decision was made to sortie ahead of the original planned timeline. A day earlier, a single day. It does not sound like much. But in war, a single day is often the difference between everything working and nothing working. Ozawa's carriers put to sea before all their reconnaissance was properly organized. His fuel supply chain was still catching. His pilots, most of them fresh graduates with limited combat training, went to war without the extra days their commanders had counted on, and they went to war against Raymond Spruance, who now knew exactly where they were coming from, because a quiet man from Dallas had gotten on his radio and told him. Sam Dealey turned harder south. He had been in Japanese-controlled waters for weeks. His fuel was low. His crew was hollow-eyed with exhaustion. Some of the younger men had begun to shake at odd moments, small tremors in their hands as they held their coffee. Sam Dealey watched them. He said nothing. Harder arrived at Darwin on June 21, 1944, for additional torpedoes. After patrolling the Flores Sea south of the Celis, she ended the patrol at Darwin on July 3. Days earlier, on June 19th, in a stretch of open ocean west of the Mariana Islands, the largest carrier battle in the history of human warfare had begun. 15 American carriers, 9 Japanese carriers, around 900 American aircraft, roughly 430 Japanese aircraft. Ozawa's fleet, arriving under all the pressures the early sortie had created, ran into a wall of American fighters. American pilots called what happened next the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The sky above the Pacific that morning was pale blue and cloudy. The kind of morning a farm boy in Nebraska might have remembered from before the war. That morning, more than 400 Japanese aircraft climbed into that blue sky and flew west, hunting American carriers. Almost none of them came back. They flew into a wall of Grumman hell. American pilots, most of them young men in their early 20s, sat in the cockpits of one of the fastest, most heavily armed carrier fighters. They had radar direction from the ships below. They had experience. They had numbers. The Japanese pilots did not. Most of them had limited flying hours. They had been rushed into service to replace the veterans lost at Coral Sea, at Midway, at Guadalcanal, and in the long, grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands. By the end of the 2-day battle, somewhere between 500 and 600 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed. American pilots lost around 30 of their own. The Japanese carrier Taiho, brand new, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was hit by a single American submarine torpedo from USS Albacore. Hours later, accumulated fuel vapor inside the ship detonated and Taiho blew apart from within. Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, was struck by torpedoes from USS Kavala and went down that same afternoon. Taiho followed on the second day, hit by American carrier aircraft. 3 Japanese fleet carriers on the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese Naval Air Arm, the same force that had struck Pearl Harbor 30 months earlier, was finished as a striking weapon. Historians would argue for decades about whether Japan could ever have won the Battle of the Philippine Sea under any. The overwhelming American advantage in aircraft, radar, and pilot training would probably have won the day regardless. But the analyses tend to reach the same conclusion on one point. Ozawa was not ready when Spruance found him. And Ozawa was less ready than he could have been because a quiet man from Dallas, in a submarine called Harder, had shaken the Japanese belief that Tawi was safe. Sam Deely never spoke about it that way. Sam Deely never spoke about himself much at all. He was, at that moment, walking a pier in Darwin, Australia. What Sam Deely did on that pier still haunts submarine officers today. Rear Admiral Ralph Christie was waiting for him. Christie was a submarine officer since before the last. He had seen commanders come home. He had seen them come home in coffins. He had learned to read the small signs, the pause before answering a question, the way a man held a coffee cup, the particular emptiness behind a young officer's eyes. Christie looked at Samuel Deely and saw those signs. Deely would eventually be credited with a 4th Navy Cross for that patrol. No submarine officer in the United States Navy would ever earn more. Christie put his hand on Deely's shoulder. "Sam," he said, "it's time." Deely did not answer. "You've done more than any 3 men in the force. You've earned every ribbon this Navy has to give. There's a training billet waiting for you back home. You go back. You see Edwina. You watch your children grow up." Sam Deely looked out at the harbor, at his boat, at Harder. A large percentage of his enlisted men were due for rotation. Torpedomen, engine men, radiomen, boys who had trained on Harder, who had learned Sam Deely's methods, who had learned to trust the quiet voice at the periscope. And they were going home, which meant that if he stepped away now, some new commander would take Harder to sea with a mostly green crew, and Deely knew what that meant. He had seen it happen to other boats. A green crew and a new captain, sent into Japanese waters together for the first time, had a way of not coming back. He was quiet for a long time. "One more patrol, Admiral," he finally said. "Let me take her out one more time. Let the new men learn the boat with the old crew still aboard. Then I'll come home." Ralph Christie closed his eyes. He was a good officer. He knew what he was supposed to do. He signed the orders. He let Sam Deely go. "One more patrol. Wait until you hear what they found 80 years later. But first you have to hear how it ended." August 5th, 1944, Fremantle, Australia. Harder cast off her lines for the 6th time. She was part of a 3-boat wolf pack now. USS Haddo, USS Hake, Harder in the lead. Samuel Deely was the Wolfpack commander. Their assigned area was the western coast of Luzon in the Philippines in the northern reaches of the South China Sea. The war had come a long way since December of 1941. American forces had rolled up the Central Pacific. American Marines had bled their way across island after island. General Douglas MacArthur was preparing to keep his promise. He was preparing to return to the Philippines. The 3 American submarines pointed their bows north, and on the afternoon of August 20th, something happened out there that almost nobody talks about. Something that could have come out of an old sea story from the age of sail. USS Ray, patrolling nearby, tracked a large enemy convoy into Paluan Bay. An hour after surfacing, Ray contacted Harder just outside the bay. And in the middle of the South China Sea in enemy waters, with Japanese air patrols overhead and hunter-killer groups on the water, 2 American submarine captains stood on their bridges and held a conversation by megaphone. Sam Deely listened as Ray's captain shouted across the water. 16 ships at least, holed up in the bay. Deely shouted back with a plan. A coordinated dawn attack. Ray from the northwest, Haddo from the west, Harder from the southwest. Then the 2 submarines slipped away into the dusk. The dawn attack the next day sent Japanese cargo ships to the bottom. The morning of August 22nd, Harder and Haddo, working together, struck 3 small Japanese coastal defense vessels off Bataan. All 3 were destroyed. According to the Naval History and Heritage Command post-war accounting, these were the escort ships Matsuwa, Sado, and Hiburi. Haddo and Harder each received official credit for sinking one. They shared credit for the 3rd. The morning of August 23rd, USS Haddo, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Chester Nimitz, Jr., the son of the Pacific Fleet Commander-in-Chief himself, spotted a tanker escorted by a destroyer. Nimitz did what his old Wolfpack leader had taught him. He turned toward the destroyer at flank speed. He fired down the throat, and he blew the bow off the enemy warship. The student had learned from the master, but Hado had also fired her last torpedo in that attack. Out of weapons, Nimitz called Harder for help. Then, out of anything more to give, Hado received Sam Deely's blessing and turned south. Hake and Harder rendezvoused with the damaged destroyer. They discussed plans for finishing her off, and then they turned north for a place called Kaiman Point off Dassel Bay along the Luzon coast. Japanese intelligence had been tracking the wolf pack for days. Escort vessels had been sent to hunt. Among those escort vessels were 2 ships that Sam Deely had probably not spent much time thinking. A Type C coastal defense ship called CD-22 and a patrol boat called PB-102. But there was one thing about PB-102 that Sam Deely almost certainly did not know, a truth that reads today like something out of a Greek tragedy. PB-102 was not born a Japanese ship. She had once been the USS Stuart, an American 4-stack destroyer, DD-224. Damaged and scuttled by her own crew at Surabaya on Java in 1942, during the desperate early days of the war, she had been captured by the Japanese, raised, repaired, and put back to sea under the rising sun. For nearly 3 years she had served the enemy who had killed her original crew. Now she was hunting Sam Deely. An American submarine, commanded by an American officer, would, in the closing hours of her life, come under fire from a ship that had been built in Philadelphia. There is one detail about that morning most people have never heard. August 24, 1944. Before dawn, USS Hake was at periscope depth some distance off Hermana May. Her captain was Lieutenant Commander Frank Hake, who was studying the sea around him through the periscope. Not far to the south of Hake, Harder was closing on an enemy escort ship that had been sighted in the area. Then Hake's sonar operator heard something. Echo ranging, close. 2 Japanese ships were coming out of the darkness. They were pinging aggressively. They were hunting. Hake's captain made an instant decision. He dove. He took his submarine deep and silent. According to Japanese action reports later recovered by American historians, Harder fired 3 torpedoes at CD-22. According to those same Japanese reports, all 3 torpedoes missed. CD-22 evaded the shots, and then CD-22 began her depth charge. What happened inside Harder in those final minutes, no living human can tell. The men who lived them lie in the deep. What we know comes from the Japanese action report. CD-22 made pass after pass over the position where Harder had disappeared. Depth charges rolled off her stern and fell into the black water. According to the surviving Japanese records, it was the 5th depth charge attack that killed. Above the surface, CD-22 continued to work the area for hours. Then, in her official record, her lookouts reported what they saw come to the surface. Oil, wood debris, cork. She reported a submarine destroyed. USS Hake did not surface until well after the danger had passed. Frank Haler waited, he listened, he tried to raise Harder on the radio. There was no reply. There would never be. 79 men were gone. Sam Deely was one of them. The message that reached Admiral Charles Lockwood at Pearl Harbor took several days to arrive. Harder is overdue and presumed lost. All hands. Lockwood sat with the message in his hand for a long time. Then he did what admirals do. He suspended operations in the area. He ordered other boats to withdraw to safer water. He would later put forward the recommendation that Samuel David Deely receive the Medal of Honor. There was another letter to be written. This one was harder. It was addressed to a house in Dallas, Texas, where a woman named Edwina lived with 3 small children. He told her that her husband had been one of the finest submarine officers the United States Navy had ever known. He told her that her husband had died doing what he believed in. He did not tell her the thing that would haunt him for the rest of his own life, that Sam Deely could have come home in the summer of 1944, that Sam Deely had been offered shore duty and had refused it, that Sam Deely had asked for one more patrol, because Sam Deely would not leave his crew. November 15, 1945, the White House. The war was over. Japan had surrendered aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay in September. American Marines were coming home. American sailors were coming home. American soldiers were coming home. 79 men from Harder were not coming. Edwina Deely stood in the East Room of the White House. Her 3 children stood beside her. President Harry Truman read the citation aloud in a plain, flat Missouri voice. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as commanding officer of the USS Harder during her 5th war patrol in Japanese-controlled waters. He read it all, every line. Then he placed the Medal of Honor in Edwina's hand. She did not cry, not there, not in front of the president, not in front of the cameras. She had done all her crying already. She took the medal home to Dallas. She raised her 3 children. She grew old. Sam Dealey's body had never been recovered. His name was engraved on the wall of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery. The grave was the South China Sea itself. The years passed. Harder was officially credited by the Navy with sinking 20.5 enemy ships during her 6 war patrols, totaling roughly 82,500 tons. She had also damaged 7 more. The half credit was awarded for a ship sunk in cooperation with Harder. She had received the Presidential Unit Citation for her first 5 war patrols. The United States Navy commissioned a destroyer escort in 1954 and named it USS Dealey. She served the fleet for 18 years. Every man who ever served aboard her knew the story of the man she was named for. At the Naval Academy in Annapolis, submarine tactics instructors began teaching a new case study. Down the throat, charge the destroyer, fire from close range, dive beneath the wreck. The tactic worked because it violated every assumption a Japanese destroyer captain had ever been taught. The men who had served under Sam Dealey grew old. They became grandfathers. They became great-grandfathers. Some of them, on Sunday afternoons in small houses in Ohio and Iowa and Georgia, would take their grandchildren onto their knees and try to explain what a submarine war had been like. They would say the boat was hot. The boat was crowded. The boat smelled of diesel and sweat and metal. The boat was afraid, but then they would say. But then there was the captain, and when they said the captain, their voices would soften. The last surviving crewman who had served aboard Harder before her final patrol lived into their 90s. When the last of them passed in the early 2020s, there was no one left alive who had heard Samuel Dealey's voice. His body had never been recovered. His grave was the South China Sea itself. And that seemed to be the end of the story, until May of 2020. A man named Tim Taylor and a team called the Lost 52 Project had spent years searching the Pacific for the American submarines that had never come home. There were 52 of them. They lay scattered across the ocean floor from the Aleutians to the Java Sea. In May of 2024, in the South China Sea, off the coast of Luzon, more than 3,000 feet below the surface, a remotely operated underwater vehicle found something. A shape on the seafloor, not a rock. A submarine. She was sitting upright on her keel, almost as if she had settled onto the sea bottom under her own control. Her pressure hull was mostly intact. There was damage aft of her conning tower where CD-22's depth charges had opened the hull. The rest of her was preserved by the dark, cold water of the deep Pacific. The Naval History and Heritage Command confirmed the identification. It was Harder. Sam Dealey was home, not to Dallas, not to Edwina, who by then had been dead for many, not to his children, who had grown into old people themselves, but he was home. Home, for a submarine sailor, means the boat. Retired Rear Admiral Samuel Cox, then the director of the Naval History and Heritage Command, wrote the words that stand as the epitaph for Harder and her crew. Harder was lost in the course of victory. We must not forget that victory has a price, as does freedom. There is a photograph of the wreck taken by the underwater vehicle. In it, you can see the outline of Harder's bow buried slightly in the sediment. You can see the round shape of the conning tower where Sam Dealey once stood at the parapet. You can see the deck gun still pointed forward, as if waiting for a target that would never come. There is a quiet dignity to the image. There is a quiet dignity to the whole story. It is a story about a man who could have gone home in the summer of 1944 and did not. It is a story about 78 other men who followed him because they trusted. It is a story about the woman who stood in a room in the White House and held a small blue box that contained everything her country could give her in exchange for what her country had taken. It is a story about the fact that some men, in some moments, choose the harder road. They choose it not out of ambition, not out of pride, not out of a hunger for glory. They choose it because there are other men counting on them. That is what Sam Dealey did. On a pier in Darwin, in the summer of 1944, when he could have gone home, he chose not to. He said, "One more patrol," he said it quietly, in the same voice he used to greet his men in the morning, and it cost him everything. But somewhere at the bottom of the South China Sea, 3,000 feet down, a submarine named Harder still stands upright on her keel, and 79 men are still aboard her, and they are still together. They are still, in the only sense that a sailor ever really cares about, together. If you had a father, a grandfather, an uncle, or a brother who served in the Pacific War, do something for me. Type their name in the comments below this video. Do not let their story disappear into silence. Because as long as we say the names, they are still with us. Samuel David Dealey, Commander, United States Navy, the destroyer killer, the man who chose to go